Subcommittees will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, and subject to the length of limitation in the rules. In a matter of weeks, Putin and his commandos stole Crimea. Now he's on to eastern Ukraine. I and other members of Congress were in Ukraine last week, and the people were rightfully concerned about Putin's next move into their nation. According to press reports this morning, Secretary Kerry said that we now have intelligence revealing that operatives in Ukraine are taking orders directly from Moscow. Secretary Kerry also said that some of the same Russian operatives from Crimea and Georgia have shown up in eastern Ukraine. When I went to eastern Ukraine, one of the officials gave me a wanted poster for what he called Russian saboteurs. It is in Ukrainian, and it's on the screen. I'll hold this up. There it is. This is a copy of the wanted poster, and he was willing to pay out of his own money for Russian equipment that had been, if it was confiscated by Ukrainians, everything from machine guns, rifles, to anybody that's occupying one of the Ukrainian buildings without permission. He's willing to offer rewards for that. So I thought that was quite interesting, that they are concerned about the insurrection or if insurgents in his own part of the state. I believe these actions we should understand that we have to reevaluate our agreements with the Russians because of their failure to abide by international law, in that they have entered Crimea, Ukraine, and even other Baltic states are concerned, and so reflected that in conversations with them. In my opinion, the Russians are not our allies, they're not our friends, and we certainly can't take them for their word. Exhibit A is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF. And this treaty between the United States and Russia places limits on ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. The United States has held up our agreement in the treaty. It appears the Russians have not. According to press reports, it appears the Russians have tested a ground-launched cruise missile from an operational launcher. The Russians have responded, this is a sea-based missile, which does not fall under the treaty. There's no way to know if it's a sea-based missile until it's actually deployed, but even so, if it was a sea-based missile and the Russians tested it on land using an operational launcher, it's in violation of the treaty. Either way, the Russians are violating this treaty. According to press reports, the administration knew about the violation back in 2008. 6 years later, the State Department says the violation is still under review and has not officially classified it as a violation or not. Time for the State Department to pick a horse and ride it. Either it's a violation or it's not a violation. I've introduced H-Con Res 94 with Representative Rogers and Joe Heck, calling the Russians out for their violation and the administration for its refusal to tell it like it is. We had hoped that a formal determination would be in this year's Arms Control Compliance Report, but the report itself, due in April, is already late. Apparently, the State Department needs more time to figure out what the rest of us already believe. The Russians do not have to worry about violations as much as the New START Treaty. During negotiations, they gutted the verifications that were in the old START Treaty. The most significant changes were the elimination of verification measures for some ICBMs and reduction of total number of inspections. When the Senate was debating approval in 2010, critics argued the treaty was nonsensical because the Russians were already at or below the required levels in key categories, while we had delivery vehicles and warheads that were way above these new levels. Just like the critics warned, the Russians have since undergone the most extensive nuclear modernization since the end of the Cold War, all without violating the New START Treaty. We had a reason to be distrustful of the Russians when the New START went into effect in 2010, and we have more reasons today. The fact is, Russians willing to treat these treaties as less than binding when it suits them. That's not how treaties are supposed to work. Despite this, the administration has pledged to seek deeper cuts in nuclear arms. In June 2013, the President called for the reduction of our deployed strategic nuclear weapons by up to 1/3. My personal opinion is this would be dangerous and is misguided based on the information that we have about the Russians. Fortunately, Putin may have saved us from ourselves. The Russians have, quote, no apparent interest in further arms reductions before 2017, according to numerous arms control experts. The United States should not continue to seek agreements with the Russians when they either cheat or show no interest in those agreements. I don't think it's not now the time to be kowtowing to Putin, and I will now turn to the ranking member from California for his opening statement. Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
I yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
A gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank Mr. Sherman for allowing me to attend a meeting where my presence is required for a quorum, and I thank Chairman Poe and Chairman Rohrabacher for convening this important hearing. I'd like to begin thanking Ms. Fried and Mr. Hartley for appearing today. Both witnesses have extensive experience on Russia and on European security interests. I'm looking forward to hearing their assessment of the long-term strategic implication of Russia's illegal invasion of Crimea, its subsequent efforts to destabilize Ukraine's interim government, and other matters. Despite its April 17th pledge to help de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine, Russia has done exactly the opposite. The role that Russian special forces have played in destabilizing eastern Ukraine is indisputable in supporting so-called separatist coordinated armed attacks on government buildings and in orchestrating kidnaps and violence against local politicians, reporters, and even OSCE monitors. Russian disinformation campaigns have only made matters worse. Russian forces use the masked warfare and other covert tactics seen to signal a strategic shift in its approach to the region and to European security. It's essential that the United States and NATO allies respond. I welcome the administration's decision yesterday to impose a third round of sanctions on individuals and entities closely linked to the Russian leadership's inner circle. I also welcome the decision to impose export restrictions on 13 Russian companies and the additional restrictive measures on defense exports. The goal of these targeted sanctions is to send a clear signal that Russian aggression against Ukraine comes at a price. I share the President's hope that these measures will persuade President Putin to reverse course. Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that the steps taken to date will be sufficient. I therefore fully support the administration's readiness to impose additional penalties if Russia continues to press forward, including targeted sanctions against specific sectors of the Russian economy. As the United States moves forward, it's imperative that we do so in a coordinated effort with our European allies. I applaud today's announcement of further EU sanctions on Russia. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Hartley about the status of the administration's ongoing discussions with the EU, as well as plans within NATO to counter Russian aggression and reassure our Central European and Baltic allies. I also look forward to hearing from Ms. Fried about the status of existing arms and existing control agreements between the United States and Russia. While further arms control reductions seem unlikely in the current environment, I'm relieved that the United States and Russia have continued to implement the New START agreement, included by exchanging notifications and conducting on-site inspections. These exchanges provide much-needed stability and predictability at a time of increasing mistrust and uncertainty. I also support the administration's efforts to work through INF treaties compliance review mechanisms to address concerns that Russian activities may be inconsistent with its treaty obligations. I strongly supported the administration's decision to cut off defense cooperation with Russia. I've consistently called on our European allies to follow suit and to exercise similar scrutiny with respect to defense exports to Russia. However, when it comes to nuclear security, the stakes are much too high to break off communication. Continued implementation of our arms control agreements with Russia is essential, especially given the unprecedented and unpredictable nature of the crisis in Ukraine. The last thing we need is another nuclear arms race in Europe. With that, I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. I now will turn to the chairman of the Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats Subcommittee, Mr. Rohrabacher from California, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Poe, for calling this hearing, and
which is jointly being held in your Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee and the subcommittee which I chair of Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats. During the 1980s, I had the honor of working with and for President Ronald Reagan. Through his leadership and strength, the United States brought about the collapse of the evil empire, the Soviet Union. I would add that there are many people who I worked with during that time period who can't seem to get over that the Cold War is over and are still treating the current Russian government as if it was the Soviet government. We are thankful, however, that the world no longer lives in fear of annihilation and no longer lives with a Soviet Union that is controlled by a diabolical philosophy of Marxism-Leninism, which motivated people to attempt to put on the world a Marxist, an atheistic dictatorship in the name of perfecting humankind. We are thankful that that world has been changed and that reality no longer is present, and that we no longer live in fear of annihilation of a nuclear exchange between those who were motivated by this evil theory, Marxism, Leninism, communism, and the people of the free world. One of Reagan's greatest accomplishments was negotiating and signing the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned 2 entire categories of horrific weapons. I look forward to this hearing today from witnesses about the current efforts to maintain and verify the provisions of that agreement. I look forward in the future to be discussing with my colleagues some of the fundamental information that they have gleaned from their visits to Ukraine and other places, and to have a broader discussion of the nature of the government in Russia today and the threat that it poses or does not pose to the free world as compared to what it was like when I worked for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. I also want to speak about another power, however, which I think that we shouldn't, when we're discussing this issue, Mr. Chairman, well, we should not lose sight that we're not just talking about Russia and the United States. We are talking about other nuclear weapons and other countries in relationship to what we're doing with the Russians, and that is, what's Communist China doing, and what are we doing with Russia and other countries that relate to this very issue of strategic weapons with Communist China? I fear that by continuing to focus our arms control efforts only on Russia, while excluding China, we are making a grave miscalculation. Our negotiations with Russia dictate our nuclear posture and define our military capabilities. It should be a major concern that China is not included in these limits, including caps set by the new Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty signed in 2010. Over the past 2 decades, the People's Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Communist Party of China, I might add, has engaged in a massive arms buildup. Their capability has increased in every area. It is illogical to believe that China's strategic forces and their nuclear stockpile have not also, likewise, been expanded and improved. The United States-China Economic Security Review Commission stated in 2012, the PLA continues to modernize and expand its nuclear stockpile. China is now on the cusp of obtaining a credible nuclear triad of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles and air-dropped nuclear bombs. End of quote. We also know, thanks to the research by Dr. Philip Garber of Georgetown University, that China has built some 3,000 miles of underground tunnels to store and to transport their nuclear missiles and warheads. This secret effort by the Chinese military is so massive it is known as the underground Great Wall. Beyond this incredible infrastructure, China is also researching hypersonic missiles, ICBMs, with maneuvering warheads, which then can outmaneuver our defensive systems. Communist China, in short, and in closing, I'd say, Communist China must be included in any discussion of arms control. And if we focus only on Russia, we are doing a great disservice to the security of our country. Addressing concerns and priorities with Russia does remain important, and the things that are being said today need to be taken into consideration. Ignoring China's strategic weapons is not an option and will lead us to a much more dangerous world. They must be part of this discussion today and hopefully in the weeks ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the ranking member from the Terrorism Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman from California, for 5 minutes.
If you watch American television, you'd think that foreign policy is as simple as a cheap Western. Some people are in white hats, some cowboys are in black hats. If you watch Russian television, you come to the same conclusion, only the hat colors have been changed. If you review what has happened, you see that this is far more complicated. A pro-Russian president was elected in legitimate elections in the Ukraine. That legitimately elected president broke his promises, turned his policy on a fundamental issue. Democratic elected presidents have been known to do that. He was swept from power by an insurrection. Those in the insurrection occupied Maidan, and it is considered a criminal act to use armed forces, organized government armed forces, to dislodge them. Now the government that has taken over in Kiev is using armed government forces to dislodge Eastern Ukrainian occupiers, not of Maidan, but of various government buildings. Throughout foreign policy, we're faced with the tension between territorial integrity and self-determination. Those were the two greatest wars fought on our own territory. Our fight for self-determination from the British and our fight for our territorial integrity and against the self-determination objectives of the Confederate States. We look at Crimea as a effort at the self-determination of the Russian-speaking majority there as an illegal act. We used our Air Force to achieve the independence of Kosovo, which, like the Crimea, was an autonomous region within a republic which was a relatively newly independent republic having seceded from a federation. One seceding from the Yugoslav Federation, the other seceding from the Soviet Union. So we have been on both sides of territorial integrity and self-determination, both on our own territory in the first 150 years of our existence and in Eastern Europe more recently. The Russians are interfering in the eastern Ukraine. Our friends in Kiev are not without fault. They have adopted a change in law that would strip the Russian language of its official status in its southern and eastern provinces. Fortunately, that law was vetoed, but clearly a parliament, and I should point out a parliament in which many of the eastern Ukrainian members felt unsafe and did not attend, would be allowed to pass such a law, shows that this is not a government dedicated to reaching out to all of its citizens. So we have the simplicity of Westerns, we have the reality of foreign policy in Eastern Europe. It is overly simplistic to say that one side's entirely right and one side's entirely wrong, just as it's even more simplistic to say that everything would go our way if only we had a president with a different personality. We had a president with a radically different personality just a decade ago when Georgia lost not one but two of its autonomous regions to Russia. Georgia being smaller, the regions being smaller, the issues being smaller. But you can say what you like about our last two presidents. The one thing everybody agrees on is they had different personalities. As to arms control agreements, We've got to trust but verify. It was Ronald Reagan entered into agreements with a Soviet Union that clearly was less trustworthy than Putin is today. Those who enter into these agreements and rely on trust are fooling themselves. The allegations are twofold. One, that that a Russian missile that they call long range was tested at an intermediate range. It seems clear that it is a long range missile. The other is that a mid-range missile that the Russians say was for sea-based purposes was tested on ground, which is allowed, but tested on ground with what appears to be a operational, usable ground-based launcher, perhaps one, and I'd like to hear from our witnesses, that was mobile. And so it appears as if they were developing a ground-based capacity for this intermediate missile. Finally, I will point out that 4 countries have given up their nuclear weapons or their nuclear programs. South Africa, where it worked out well. Saddam, Gaddafi, and the Ukraine. 2 of them lost their lives. 1 of them lost the Crimea. It may be more difficult in the future for us to convince dictators to give up nuclear weapons. It doesn't always work out well. I yield back.
Without objection, all the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record, and I ask that each witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. We are in the middle of votes, so we will see how far we can go before we recess for votes, and we will resume immediately after the votes. I'll introduce both of the witnesses at this time. Ms. Anita Fried is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear and Strategic Policy for the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance at the U.S. Department of State. Ms. Fried has earned numerous awards, including 7 Superior Honor Awards for her work on U.S., Russian, European issues.
Mr. Chairman, are other members allowed to give short opening statements?
All members may have 5 days to submit statements due to the fact that we have votes and we also have 2 subcommittees. So they can make their comments during their questioning if they wish. Mr. Brent Hartley is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Mr. Hartley has extensive experience in European security issues and has served in various roles related to arms control, counterterrorism, and NATO, and more. Ms. Fried, we'll start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Poe, Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Members Sherman and Keating, and members of this committee, I am grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today about the administration's arms control policy toward Russia. Today, I want to speak to you about 3 things. 1, why arms control agreements with Russia continue to be an important tool to enhance the security of the United States, our allies and partners. 2, how we have used arms control tools since the crisis in Ukraine began to increase transparency and stability in support of our broader regional efforts. And 3, the seriousness with which the administration takes compliance and arms control treaties. First, as it has been recognized for over 4 decades, arms control is a tool that can be used to enhance the security of the United States, our allies, and our partners. The Obama administration has continued the long-standing bipartisan approach to arms control with Russia that had its origins in the days of the Cold War. The administrations of Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were the architects of many of our most successful and enduring arms control efforts. Let me affirm that the United States is committed to maintaining strategic stability between the United States and Russia and to encouraging mutual steps to foster a more stable, resilient, predictable, and transparent security relationship. That said, Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine have undermined trust. While diplomacy between the United States and Russia continues, no one can ignore that Russia's actions in Ukraine have violated the very principles upon which cooperation is built. Further, as we consider arms control priorities this year or in any year, we will continue to consult closely with our allies and partners every step of the way. Our security and defense, as well as that of our allies and partners, is non-negotiable. We will only pursue arms control agreements that advance our national interest. During the Cold War, Washington and Moscow found it in our mutual interest to work together to cap and then to begin reducing the number of nuclear weapons in service, in reversing the nuclear arms race, and improving mutual security and stability. We judged that the New START Treaty was in the United States' national security interest for the same reasons, and that is why we continue to implement the New START Treaty with Russia today. We are now in the 4th year of implementation, and despite the crisis in Ukraine, we and Russia continue to implement the treaty in a business-like manner. Since entry into force in 2011, the United States has inspected, with boots on the ground, Russian nuclear weapons facilities 58 times. These inspections are as a part of the New START Treaty verification regime, which is a vital tool in ensuring transparency and predictability between the world's largest nuclear powers. In the realm of conventional arms control, the United States and our allies have been using arms control mechanisms in an effort to promote stability in Europe, provide transparency in Russia's provocative actions, and assure our allies and partners. I want to underscore that our NATO allies and other partners in Europe strongly support arms control in Europe, as well as our active participation and leadership in those efforts. Since the Ukraine crisis began, the United States and our treaty partners have used the Open Skies Treaty to fly 11 missions over Ukraine and Western Russia, yielding imagery of thousands of square miles of territory. These flights have resulted in valuable data and insights not only for the United States, but our partners and allies as well. We also have confidence-building measures in the Vienna document to conduct inspections. I've used confidence-building measures in the Vienna document to conduct inspections in Ukraine. Let me now turn to the issue of compliance. First and foremost, the administration takes compliance with all arms control agreements extremely seriously. For this reason, this administration worked hard to produce a compliance report in 2010, the first compliance report delivered to the Congress since 2005, and we have produced one every year since. We endeavor every year to produce a compliance report by April 15th. This is admittedly challenging, given the volume of information, the multiple agencies that must comment on it, and the seriousness with which the administration conducts its annual compliance review. Despite this, we plan to have the report fully coordinated and available later in the spring. As we have previously stated, we have concerns about Russian compliance with the INF Treaty. We have raised these concerns with Russia and are pressing for clear answers in an effort to resolve these concerns because of the importance of the INF Treaty to Euro-Atlantic security. We've briefed our NATO allies on our concerns and will continue to coordinate with them on this and other matters that affect our common security. We have kept Congress informed on this matter through briefings with relevant congressional committees and will continue to do so. We will continue to work with Russia to resolve our concerns and to encourage mutual steps to help foster a more stable, resilient, transparent security relationship. We're not going to drop the issue until our concerns have been addressed. Let me conclude by reiterating our strong belief that arms control treaties and agreements continue to be an important tool that can enhance the security of the United States and our friends and allies. The successful implementation of the New START Treaty and the important contributions that Open Skies Treaty and the Vienna document have played recently in Ukraine demonstrate the continued relevance of arms control for our national security. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Freed. Mr. Hartley, we just have a few minutes left in the voting process, so we will do your testimony as soon as we come back. We have 2 votes. After the second vote is concluded, we will start immediately after that, and we'll hear what you have to say. Committee's in recess. Subcommittees will come to order. Mr. Hartley, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committees. I appreciate very much your inviting me to testify here today on our efforts to reassure allies and partners and to bolster security in Ukraine and the region. And I would like to thank the members of both subcommittees, or both committees, for your engagement on European security in light of the Ukraine crisis. It is important to remember how we got to this point. Russia's illegal annexation and occupation of Crimea and its continued campaign to undermine and intimidate the government of Ukraine have upended the post-Cold War security architecture that Russia had in fact helped to create. Russia is maintaining a contingent of 40,000 troops on Ukraine's eastern border and conducting military activities that raise deep concerns. There is strong evidence demonstrating that the actions of recent weeks, the roadblocks, building seizures, hostage takings, and other violent acts in eastern Ukraine, primarily in the Donetsk Oblast, have not been a spontaneous set of events, but rather a well-orchestrated campaign led by Russian special services. We strongly condemn the abduction last Friday of a German-led Vienna document inspection team and their Ukrainian escorts in Slovyansk by pro-Russian separatists. We are deeply disappointed that senior officials in Moscow have not condemned the abduction of the team, nor have they demanded the team's immediate release. Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine are in violation of international law and do not uphold the letter or the spirit of the April 17th Geneva Statement. Yesterday, the United States acted, imposing new sanctions on 7 Russian government officials, including 2 members of President Putin's inner circle and 17 companies linked to Putin's inner circle. These steps demonstrate that the United States is committed to increase the costs on Russia as it persists in its efforts to destabilize Ukraine, and that we will hold Russia accountable for its provocative actions. Russia's actions have also forced the United States and NATO allies to fundamentally re-examine our strategic engagement in Europe. My testimony today will focus on 3 areas of this effort. First, I will talk about efforts to reassure NATO's frontline allies and to bolster our other partners in the region. Second, I will discuss the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's important role in monitoring the security situation and facilitating dialogue in Ukraine. Third, I'll address U.S. bilateral security assistance to Ukraine. First, we are pursuing measures through NATO and bilaterally to reassure our allies and partners in the region, and in particular to demonstrate our solemn commitment to our collective defense responsibilities to our NATO allies. We've deployed 6 additional F-15s to the Baltic Air Policing Mission. We've deployed 12 F-16s and other aircraft and personnel for exercises, joint U.S.-Polish exercises coordinated by the U.S. Aviation Training Detachment in Wask, Poland. NATO's deployed AWACS to provide aerial surveillance over Poland and Romania, as well as a mine countermeasure naval group into the Baltic Sea. The United States has deployed ships into the Black Sea for exercises with Romania and Bulgaria. On April 16th, NATO allies agreed on additional measures to provide reassurance and demonstrate NATO's resolve and solidarity. The U.S. Army in Europe has deployed over the last week company-sized contingents of paratroopers to Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia for exercises with those host government troops. These will be the first in a series of expanded land force training exercises in the region that will take place at least through the end of the year. As we prepare for the NATO summit in Wales, it will be an opportunity to reassess the alliance's long-term priorities in the wake of Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine. That, along with NATO-Ukraine relations, questions related to the open door and NATO enlargement, Afghanistan capabilities, and enhancing NATO partnerships. Beyond NATO's borders, we're engaged with other frontline states like Georgia and Moldova, and I'd be happy to get into more detail on that in the question and answer period. Second, we see a vital role for the OSCE in this crisis. Along with our allies in Europe, we are committed to maintaining a large presence of international monitors as part of the OSCE's special monitoring mission. This mission is positioned to objectively assess the security situation and investigate claims of human rights abuses, as well as to assist in de-escalating tensions in eastern Ukraine. But for this mission to be properly implemented in accordance with the Geneva Statement, Russia must take active and concrete steps immediately to de-escalate the crisis, including public and private messages to pro-Russian elements engaged in illegal activities in Ukraine, as well as active support for the monitoring mission's role. OSCE is also involved in election observation for the May 25th election. The Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or ODIHR, is laying the groundwork for the largest observation mission in its history, in its 40-year history, planning to deploy approximately 1,000 observers in the run-up to the election. Third, we're working with the Ukrainian government to provide security assistance. As Vice President Biden announced last week, we're providing $8 million in assistance to allow the Ukrainian Armed Forces and Border Guard Service to fulfill core security missions. This is in addition to the $3 million of meals ready to eat, $3.5 million of health and welfare assistance to the armed forces, and $3 million in other security assistance to Ukraine's State Border Guard Service. Looking forward, the United States will continue to reaffirm the security and stability of the region across multiple fronts, using multiple tools at our disposal. In this effort, we appreciate Congress's bipartisan attention and support for Ukraine and for stability across the region, and will continue to work in close coordination with you on all three of these areas. Sir, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks for yielding back time. The chair will now recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And as I say, perhaps the focus of this hearing, which we originally thought would be our weapons, nuclear weapons, and the relationship between the United States and Russia in terms of cooperating on reducing and restricting the number of nuclear weapons that threaten humankind. We have gone beyond that, and we, of course, however, I believe the purpose of that is to put in perspective the decisions we must make in terms of weapons control after the events that have happened in Ukraine. Let me just note that from my perspective, there's been too gleeful a response by so many of my former colleagues, and I'm not talking about members of the House, I'm talking about people who worked with me over the years in various administrations and various anti-communist causes. There seems to be a gleeful response to what's happened in Ukraine, because it then gives them yet a purposeful a purpose in going back and beating up the old enemy. And frankly, the Soviet Union was our enemy because it was directed by people with an ideology that it was trying to supplant in the rest of the world, and doing so in a big way, as well as building up their own military. Russia is a powerful force in the world, which we need to deal with as a major country, a major nation. Major countries have their interests. I do not see what's going on in Ukraine as a outcome of the communist ideology, but instead you have a very important international power there, Russia, that is governed by someone who's looking out for its national interests, and who, that leadership of that country obviously believes that what was going on in Ukraine was contrary to their national interests, and that they were not being treated fairly in a way in which a pro-Russian leader was removed from office by street violence rather than by elections, which was going to result in their losing what they had was access to the Crimea and a port for their fleet. That said, I'd like to go back to the original purpose that we came here today, was to talk about arms control and how that will be impacted by this new shift in our relations with Russia. And I say that no matter what I just said, the bottom line is, it is in recognition that we are now not in as a positive relationship or a neutral relationship that we were in 2 years ago with Russia. We are, in fact, in our relationship with Russia has deteriorated. Whose fault that is, and does the Russian government, does Putin and we have all the blame, or do we share some of it, or was there a power grab by the EU? That's something that take long to discuss. But the fact is, we know that relationship has deteriorated. What I would like to ask the panel is, does this mean that that what we negotiated with, and I'm very proud of what Ronald Reagan accomplished in eliminating a whole classification of nuclear weapons and brought down the number of nuclear weapons that threaten the world, does that mean that we can no longer work with Russia in this area? Or should we postpone our efforts or pull back from cooperation with the current Russian government and on those issues? Should we then also pull back from economic cooperation? Should we declare the space program that we are partners with Russia now to be not something that we believe we can count on, and thus we should go the opposite direction? What about that? What are the implications for arms control? What are the implications for cooperating in other areas with Russia on this whole Ukrainian situation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be pleased to answer that question. First of all, I would say that this administration has made it very clear that it is important to continue to cooperate with Russia where we can, where our national security interests coincide. But then when we disagree, and we make our disagreement very clear. So there's no question that it is in our national security interest to continue to work with Russia and international partners in multilateral efforts that are key to global security. Such efforts as elimination of Syria chemical weapons, for example, our work together on Iran, and I would add also our work together in the arms control field. And that means a continued implementation of arms control
So you're not advocating, so the administration and what you're suggesting today, good policy would be not to punish Russia in those areas for what they're doing in Ukraine?
I would not say punish. We have a very clear position on the events in Ukraine, and it's...
So we should not let cooperation be a tool, then. Mr. Hartley, and could you answer that, and then I've already taken too much time, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir, thank you for that question. Well, as Anita said, there are areas where both we and the Russians perceive our national interests to coincide, and Anita outlined a number of them. One area where we now have a very profound difference is over what the post-Cold War European security environment should be, what the ground rules are. Coming out of the Cold War, we thought some very clear rules based on the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 and other agreements that European borders would not be changed by force. The Russians have undertaken to do that with regard to Crimea. We believe that they are actively involved using their special forces and other agents to destabilize eastern Ukraine. And it's for that reason, because of this behavior contrary.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, again, as we discuss this, China is still in the world and in the picture. And I would hope that as we work these problems out, that we keep in mind that China has to be part of the equation, or the world will be less secure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair will recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
This has become, to some extent, a Ukraine hearing, and we are honored by the presence of the Deputy Assistant Secretary from the relevant bureau. Mr. Hartley, has the Ukrainian government been successful in disarming anti-Russia militias?
Thank you, sir, for that question. My expertise falls more on the NATO, the OSCE, and the bilateral security assistance side. It is my impression that they've made some progress there, but I would be happy to take that question for a more authoritative response.
Okay. While you take that question, the other question is, what are we doing to urge the government in Kiev to honor and even make less subject to alteration statutes adopted in the past to assure the Russian language would be an official language in the south and east of Ukraine? What are we doing to say, yes, there may be forces, political forces in Kiev that say, let's impose the Ukrainian language on everyone, and there may be forces on the other side. I, for one, understand America spending its treasure and taking risks for the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. I'm an agnostic as to what language should be spoken in the East, and I would hate to think that we find ourselves exposed to risk and cost because the non-compromising elements prevail in Kiev on these language issues. Ms. Fried, has Russia put forward any arguments that we are in violation of any of the arms control agreements that we've entered into with Russia or with its predecessor government?
Thank you for that question, sir. Yes, as a matter of fact, Russia, when we issue our annual compliance report, every year, at least this administration, the Russians regularly come back with some.
So they have an annual compliance report, which may even be issued on time. Sorry about that. Sorry. Go ahead. And what do you think is their strongest complaint?
Strongest complaint, the one I would say, I can't give you all of their complaints right now because I haven't looked at them recently, but certainly our missile defenses is what they focus on.
Which treaty do they believe the missile defense efforts are in violation of?
Well, it would be more than likely the INF treaty is one.
Okay. Now, as I'm trying to understand what is the legal obligation of Russia with regard to intermediate missiles that they claim will be used only in naval warfare. As I understand it, they're allowed to test these missiles from a ground-based launcher, but not if that ground-based launcher would be the effective launcher to use in case hostilities broke out. What are they allowed to do on land in order to test weapons that they say are exclusively for naval use?
Sir, quite frankly, thank you for your question. I'm not prepared right now to go into technical details. The focus here is...
I'm asking what the treaty provides. I'm asking for you to just inform us what the treaty provides. What is the United States allowed to do? What is... I'm not asking for a secret here.
No, not at all a secret. It's a technical... But let me just briefly state that, as I mentioned before, that we have very serious concerns, and as you have stated, that Russia is developing a ground-launched cruise missile that is inconsistent with the INF Treaty. And we have made those concerns very clear to the Russians.
I'm hoping you would make them clear to us. Is the mere testing of, and Mr. Hartley, I don't know if you have a comment on this, the mere testing of this missile a violation if they can claim that it's that they only plan to deploy it on ships?
Sir, that would go into the specific range and such that it is tested. So it's
well, it's being tested for intermediate. You know, it's an intermediate range missile. The question is it a naval intermediate range missile, or are they creating a ground-based intermediate missile?
Sir, I can't get into details here, I'm afraid, on that topic because of the, I'd be happy to talk about
the details I want are what are the provisions of the treaty, but my time has more than expired. I thank you for your time.
Thank the gentleman. Mrs. Freed, it's taken 5 years for the State Department to reach a verdict on this treaty, in my opinion. So my question is, are the Russians, in our point of view, in violation of the treaty? And I see only one of three answers. Yes, no, you don't know. So which one of those is the answer?
Sir, we're in the process of finalizing the annual compliance report, and we will have a finding shortly.
So you can't tell me whether it's yes or no, or you don't know?
I can't at this point because, as I mentioned, it is...
Well, when are you going to have this report ready? It's like the ranking member
this-
said, it's overdue.
Sir,
It's 5 years taken to get a report here. Either they're in compliance or they're not in compliance. We got to make foreign policy decisions, and we don't know if the Russians are cheating or not. So how long is it going to, when are we going to get a verdict on the report?
Sir, we report on this issue every year on the INF treaty, and at this point, the annual compliance report is in the process of being finalized.
So when will it be finalized?
Later this spring.
No, you don't know. Okay. Each of you have said that the actions by Putin are illegal. You've seen that there's some disagreement here as to whether Russia can do what they're doing internationally or not. Why is the action of Russia going into Crimea and then now eastern Ukraine illegal in the United States point of view? You both said it was illegal, so why is it illegal?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. By undertaking the actions they did, the Russians have violated their commitments under the UN Charter. That's from a legal standpoint. From a political standpoint, they've violated, they have broken commitments made under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, and as well as the commitments under the Helsinki Final Act, among others.
Ms. Freed, do you have any other comments other than what Mr. Hartley has already said on why the action is illegal?
No, sir. I think Mr. Hartley has answered the question.
When I was in Ukraine and in recent weeks have talked to other heads of state in the area, they're not the only country that is concerned about their territorial integrity. Moldova, other former Soviet republics, not in NATO, and some that are in NATO. Are their concerns warranted? Mr. Hartley?
Yes, sir, if I may. Of course, they
And I'm talking about concerns of Russia coming in and taking over some of their territory. That's my question.
Yes, sir. The actions that the Russians have undertaken with regard to Crimea and what they're doing in eastern Ukraine gives deep cause for concern on the part of those nations. Any country that has a Russian minority or Russian-speaking minority, at least according to Mr. Putin in his April 18th speech, according to Mr. Putin's public statements, would seem at risk of be at risk of Russian intervention.
The Ukrainian government, on the issue of interest of Russians in the East, there's no definition as to what a Russian is. Is it a Russian that was born in Russia? Is it a Russian that has moved to eastern Ukraine? Is it a Russian who wants to be Russian? There's no definition as to what a Russian is. Do we have a definition of what a Russian is in the eastern part of the Ukraine?
I don't know that we do, sir.
It means different things to different people.
That's true. And the way Mr. Putin seems to define it is an ethnic Russian or a Russian speaker.
The elections in Ukraine are coming up May 26th, I believe. I think it's important for stability in Ukraine that they have these elections, that they are fair, that people vote. Do you see, I'm asking you just to kind of look 26 days in the future, do you see that the Russians may cause a disturbance, a crisis, to try to postpone these elections? It seems like to me, and they cause a crisis, then they want to solve the crisis by moving in their their troops. So are we expecting a possible crisis to try to get these elections postponed?
Sir, thank you for that. Well, I would be hesitant to speculate too far into the future. The conditions are such that that is a legitimate concern. In the negotiation of the Geneva Statement, the U.S., the EU, and the Ukrainians all urged the inclusion of a sentence that referred to the May 25th elections and the need that they be carried out in an orderly and transparent way. The Russians refused to include that in the text of the statement. The disruptions are already taking place in eastern Ukraine that are bound to complicate the election efforts. And we believe that that the instability there is being fomented by the Russians.
Thank you, Mr. Hartley, Ms. Freet. The chair will yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, there was a beginning where we thought that we'd be entering a new world, where we would be able to have, as we did with the New START Treaty, for example, we're not abolishing nuclear weapons altogether. There was, we were moving in the right direction. Senate ratified it, the treaty, and the Russian Federation then right after ratified the treaty. And there's a lot of things going on, because it seems to me when we're dealing with Crimea and dealing with the East Ukraine, we've got to balance a number of issues also. Our NATO allies, I believe that sanctions work, but only when they're multilateral sanctions. If we do sanctions individually, they're not as strong as they would be multilaterally, yet a number of our NATO allies have concerns, and we've got to make sure that they are part of whatever we do. We can't separate ourselves, in my viewpoint, from them, and that's why our NATO allies are tremendously important. Some of them are more dependent upon Russia than others. And some arms control experts continue to report that Russia could potentially withdraw from treaties such as the INF, and that they may any further expansion of arms control efforts will likely make no headway for the foreseeable future. And some of my colleagues, and I hear some of the pundits, et cetera, saying give weapons, and some saying more sanctions. Very few people are talking about diplomatic solutions. So my first question is, do either one of you, do you still see, I always try to believe that there's hope, that we always should talk and have conversation with nations that we don't disagree with. Is diplomacy an option here? Do you see diplomacy having a chance here, or have we, or it has no chance? What role do you think diplomacy has in this?
Thank you, sir. We believe that diplomacy is a critical aspect of this. That is why Secretary Kerry has had, I forget, 6, 8, 10 conversations with Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, over the last couple of weeks. That's why he went to Geneva to negotiate the terms of the Geneva Statement that laid out a pathway for de-escalation. So we very much believe that that diplomacy is the way to resolve this, to find a political solution. The sanctions that we're imposing have been imposed only after those efforts have so far proven fruitless. But our sanctions are scalable, they're flexible. If the Russians make the decision that they want to de-escalate the situation and return to behavior consistent with international norms, then we can reverse the sanctions. But even as we go forward, taking a harder line on those, we want to keep the door open for a diplomatic solution.
And that being the case, trying to prevent a scenario that we currently have, and I do see some of the other regions, whether it's in the Caucasus, the Baltic, or the Eastern Europe or Central Asia, we've got to focus on some of those countries now. I've got a lot of friends in those countries. I think Mr. Chairman Poe may have said something. What do we say to them now? Or what should we do? I mean, when you look at Ukraine, its economy was in the tank, and some say Crimea is going to be a big burden on on Russia, as it seems right now, but we've got to firm up the rest of the Ukraine economically. What do you see that we can do? Mr. Hartley, you talked about that there's huge concerns right now about Russia, or at least some of these countries about Russia coming in. What can we do now before there is any possibility of Russia invading? What can we do to help those countries now so that we can make them, assure them that we're there, that the NATO's there? What do you think we can do right now? Perspective.
Thank you, sir. Well, with regard to NATO allies, particularly those we've now come to call frontline states, the three Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. We have already deployed U.S. forces, land, sea, and air, and NATO allies are deploying, at this point, principally sea and air assets in a measured way to underscore that the Article 5 commitment to collective defense is credible and has teeth. So we are in constant consultation with our NATO allies at NATO headquarters.
Let me just ask, I'm out of time. I just want to ask this one last question. Do you think Russia's backing down from its arms agreements with the United States and preparing to have a continued military escalation? That's what some are saying, that, in other words, people are saying that Russia's building up and they're strong and kind of daring the United States to have a military escalation, or NATO to come up and meet them militarily. Do you see that that's part and parcel of what's going on here?
Sir, thank you for that question. That is precisely why the New START Treaty is so important. The fact that we have, and the fact that it has been successfully implemented since it was signed and inspections began in 2011. The Russians are implementing the New START Treaty, and it does set the limits on their ability to build up nuclear forces. So
and you don't see them violating that right now?
No, sir. No,
Okay.
sir.
So there's still cooperation in that regards?
Yes, sir.
And there are a number of other things that they're still cooperating with us on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get back.
Chairman yields back.
May I add to that, sir, or do you want to move on?
You can make it brief.
Okay. On the conventional side, the Russians have been modernizing, and it has been a source of some concern, but we feel as though the assets available to the NATO alliance are sufficient to deter any incursions on NATO territory.
Thank you, Mr. Hartley. The chair will recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry. for 5
Thanks,
minutes.
thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, appreciate your time. Ms. Freet, the State Department is aware that Russia may have been in violation of the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty while negotiating the New START Treaty. The first question is when, as far as you understand it, did the administration first learn of the possible violation of the INF Treaty by the Russians? Was it in 2008?
Sir, the New START Treaty, ratification of the New START Treaty did not, I mean, it was, at that time, Russia was implementing the INF Treaty successfully. At this point, I would prefer to go into closed sessions to deal with the circumstances, the specific dates on the specific questions you asked.
Okay, then let me ask you this. When the President was overheard talking to Medvedev at the time, he said that after the election he could be more flexible. And this is in the context of members of Congress being concerned about our national security posture and our ability to secure our nation in light of adversaries and enemies, if you want to call some folks that. What did he mean by that? What do you think he meant by that?
Sir, what I can say here is that the United States and this administration will only pursue arms control agreements that are in the United States' national security interest. And that is something that this administration, that the President believes.
But if we know, or if we suspect with some credibility that our partner in negotiation is cheating, at the time we are negotiating a reduction in our capability, how is that, and we don't take that into account, and we continue to march forward with our reduction, how, can you explain to me how that is in our best interest?
Sir, as I mentioned in my statement, this administration takes compliance with arms control treaties very seriously. During the negotiation of the New START treaty, we took compliance with arms control treaties into consideration.
But we knew, or we suspected while we were negotiating the treaty that they were cheating. And we continued forward, and it's fine to continue forward with the negotiation. We, as far as you know, and as far as Russia is concerned, based on your testimony, have upheld our end of the bargain. We still don't know, according to your testimony, we won't know till later this spring, and by the way, spring's almost over, to the extent of their cheating. And I recognize and acknowledge the sensitivity of the date, so I'll be happy to talk to you in closed session about that. But my concern is that we're unilaterally disarming America while we know, or we suspect, with some certainty that Russia is cheating on their end of the deal, and I still don't understand how that's in our best interest.
Thank you for that question, sir. The United States, arms control is in the United States' national security interest.
Yeah, it's in our interest when we're controlling theirs, or they're controlling theirs within the paradigm as well as ours, but it's not in our interest when we're controlling ours and they're not controlling theirs to our satisfaction in accordance with the previous agreement. Would you agree?
Sir, we take compliance, this administration takes compliance with arms control very seriously. I'm happy to discuss the specifics in closed session. Let me say, with respect to the START treaty, that was a very carefully negotiated agreement based on the Nuclear Posture Review. That was a document that received interagency, very close study by then Secretary Gates and by then Chairman of the Joint Staff Mullen.
But did they have the knowledge at that time? Because we didn't, and again, maybe you want to wait till closed session, but it's my understanding that we didn't report our suspicion or our knowledge of their breach of the previous treaty while the negotiation was happening to our NATO allies. Did our negotiators, did Secretary Gates, did he know at that time, while he was in agreement with this accord, that we had a very strong suspicion that they were cheating on the previous agreement?
Sir, I would like to take you up on your offer to do this in closed session.
All right, then moving on. Based on recent actions in Crimea, do you think the American people should trust the Russians to adhere to a bilateral and multilateral arms control agreement? And if so, why?
Sir, this administration believes in trust but verify. So verification and compliance with arms control treaties is very important.
Let me ask you one final question with due indulgence, Mr. Chairman. So if we find out and if we prove, and in the springtime, if it's determined and you report that they had indeed cheated, for lack of a better phrase, on the previous treaty, the previous agreement, what will be the ramifications?
Sir, I'm not prepared to discuss this at this point. When the report is finalized, we will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Discuss it.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it, your testimony today. Why do you think Russia's become so emboldened here, going back to August of 2010, as far as invading other countries? I thought it was a simple question. I'm sorry.
Thank you, sir. If only there were simple questions in this life. It is, of course, difficult to know precisely why the Russians and Mr. Putin have taken the actions they have. There are factors related to history, factors related to concern about the influence that a successful democracy and market economy on its border by a country that used to be part of Russia might have on the, or part of the Russian Empire might have on the rest of the population in Russia.
Okay, let me go in a different direction here. As you said, there's the simple questions, but the answers aren't often simple. Do you see the 2010 START treaty, with us reducing our weapons to 1,550 and with the President Obama and the administration willingness to reduce further, unilateral cuts to 1,000. Do you think that's emboldened the Russians, Mr. Putin and the Russians?
Thank you for that question, sir. No, I do not.
Okay. Do you see Russia viewing us as weak, undecisive, not willing? Our credibility has been damaged. If you go back over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, you know, red lines, no red lines, regimes must change. We never said regimes must change. Not fulfilling the missile defense system in Poland, and you know, putting a stop to that. Do you think they see us as just kind of being weak and not with strong resolve?
Sir, I do not see U.S. foreign policy as weak.
Okay. How about you, Mr. Hartley?
No, sir. I agree with Anita.
All right. So with what's going on in Venezuela in our own backyard, with what China is doing, drawing an arbitrary no-fly zone, with Syria and Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon. In fact, just here a couple months ago, we were told that Iran would have enough material to develop 5 to 6 nuclear bombs within 4 to 5 months. What I'm seeing from where I'm sitting and what I read is the lone superpower that Bill Clinton talked about, that America could no longer afford to be, becoming weaker. Everybody else is becoming emboldened, and I see people flexing their muscles because of our weakness and that lack of resolve that we have. Where do you think this will lead? Where do you think Russia will end up? Are they going to go into Transnistria? Do you see them going into there? Because that's a large Russian-speaking population. Do either one of you see that?
Sir, we see that there's a risk. The Russians have influence in Transnistria, but it is our policy to exact a cost from the Russians for their behavior that is in violation of international norms.
All right. And do you feel the sanctions that we were talking about that we've done, do you think they'll have any impact on Russia's aggression?
Sir, the purpose of the sanctions is to try to influence Russian behavior to bring it back within international norms.
How's that working so far, Ms. Reed?
Well, actually, that's Mr. Brent. Go ahead.
If I may, sir.
Yeah.
This could be a long process, sir.
All right. But again, do we have compliance with other nations? Are they putting strong sanctions in place too? Is it just us doing this unilaterally?
Sir, yesterday, as we announced our third round of sanctions, we were joined by the G7, which includes Japan, Canada, and 4 of the major EU members, but the entire EU also joined. The Norwegians, who are not part of the EU, also adhere to EU sanctions. So we have a broad international coalition that is focused on bringing Russia back into compliance with international norms.
Let me ask you one other question. Do we have troops on the ground in Ukraine right now?
Sir, we do not have combat troops. I mean, it depends on how you define it. We have a defense attaché. We have officials from the Pentagon that visit. But I think the simple answer is no.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. A couple more questions from the chair, and then I'll give the ranking member time if he wishes. Are the Russians going to give Crimea back? Mr. Hartley?
Sir, we're doing everything we can to encourage that.
Okay, I know we're doing that, but are they going to give it back at the end of the day? Is it going to be part of Ukraine? Is it going to be part of Russia?
Sir, it's our policy that it remains a part of Ukraine and should be returned to Ukrainian control.
So you don't know. How about you, Ms. Freed?
I agree with Mr. Hart.
Okay, we don't know. The 20 kidnapped election watchers, who kidnapped them?
Sir, it was a Vienna document inspection team. They weren't election observers. It was the team originally was composed of 8 Europeans led by the Germans, and they had 5 Ukrainian escorts with them. They were kidnapped by pro-Russia individuals or a pro-Russia group in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, what were they doing in eastern Ukraine? You say they're... Inspectors of what?
They were there under the Vienna documents, sir. All 57 nations that are participating states in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to include Russia, have agreed to a set of measures that are intended to build confidence among the partners, among the participants. One mechanism of that is our inspections that each participating state is obliged to receive a certain number of inspections every year, but they can also offer voluntary inspections.
So they went over there for inspections of what?
They were there to inspect Ukrainian military installations and deployments, but also to
And they were
engage-
kidnapped by Russian sympathizers. So
correct, sir.
all right, last question. Is Europe slow-walking sanctions because they're concerned about the fact that many of them are totally dependent on Russia for their energy and that Russia may then just retaliate? Is that one of their concerns about sanctions? Mr. Meeks asked about the Europeans and their not being too supportive as we would hope in this. Is that part of the reason, or do you know, Mr. Hartley?
Both we and the Europeans are looking for ways for sanctions that will maximize the impact on the Russians while minimizing the impact on our own economies and businesses. So it is fair to say that that is a consideration of the Europeans, sir.
All right, thank you. I'll yield to the ranking member if he has any more questions. All right, I want to thank both of our witnesses for their participation, and any other questions that any members of the panel have will be put in writing, and we would expect a response from you. Thank you very much for being here. Subcommittee is adjourned.